I've put together this DC route guide for the benefit of those who have not done DC before, or those who just want to get a better idea of what lies ahead on the day. It's important to note that this route guide is not in any way intended to scare anyone off or to exaggerate anything, but it's merely just to give an honest opinion and a guide to what you can expect throughout the day. So where better to start off, but obviously at the start line. As we line up, obviously the announcer will call out when we're going to go. Teams, as far as I know, leave every 30 seconds. So as we roll off, we'll head through the suburb of Swellendam. Legs are cold, but that's not going to be for too long, because as we take the turn and head towards the N2, we'll be faced with our first climb. Now when I say climb, it's a small rise that just basically takes us up and out of Swellendam and towards the N2. Once we've turned left onto the N2, as per the Cycle Tour Trust video that they sent out recently, they've asked that we stay in single file as far as possible for the stretch that we do on the N2. We're going to be on the N2 for about 9 kilometers before we eventually get to the turn that will take us towards Suurbrak. So we'll follow this main road for a while, which takes us to and eventually through the town of Suurbrak. At about 28 km into the right, we'll approach a left turn, which will take us onto the R317, which is when we'll face our first proper climb of the day, Tradouw Pass. The Strava segment for Tradouw Pass puts this as a 6 kilometer climb with an average gradient of I think it was 3.4%. Now here you at the back of the class asking what does that mean in real world terms. So I was looking at some familiar climbs, things that we may be used to riding, and the closest match I could find was the Landadno climb from the 12 Apostles Hotel up to the top of Sekerossi. An important note is that the top of the Tradouw Pass, which is also a water point, will be our first stop and regroup point to ensure that we're all together before we start the descent. And when I say stop, I mean that when we get to the top, we're going to pass this water point on the left and stand as far left off the road as possible, just to stay out of the way of the other riders and teams that are passing by and those that are leaving the water point as well. The descent that follows is about 3 kilometers long, and that's followed by a short 1 kilometer climb as we climb out of the pass and we head towards the R62. At the T-junction, the marshals will show us to head left as we make our way towards Montagu along the R62. And this is about 45 kilometers into the ride. So from here we'll have about 15 kilometers to consider our life choices as we head towards the base of Tradouw. And this stretch has an average gradient of about 1%, so it's a really good time, I think, that we can ride in pairs and do rotations in pairs as well, just as a suggestion. We'll then face the Tradouw climb itself, which is 5 kilometers with an average gradient of I think 5.9%. Again, looking at something that's similar, just to give you some context, is if we look at the climb from the Deze River Road in Houtbay up to the top of Constantia Neck, so that's essentially Constantia Neck on the Houtbay side, that is 2.5 kilometers at 5.9% as well. So if you think about it, up to Tradouw would be the same in terms of the gradient and the steepness of it, but essentially it's going to be twice as long. At the top of the Tradouw climb will be our second stop and regroup point before we head off towards Montagu. There's a flat section at the top of the Tradouw climb before we actually get to the descents. We also need to pass the water point, so we will keep right of the water point to avoid any of the teams that are slowing down to actually turn off at that point, as well as to avoid those teams that are rejoining the road. There are cones that are put out into the road, so we'll just keep to the right of those. There's a short descent followed by a short rise before we get to the actual big and very fast descent of the day. So those who are nervous descenders or who prefer to take their time going down this fast descent, I think just stick to that, take your time, don't do any or take unnecessary risks. The fast descent takes a turn to the right and then back to the left, and it leads into a short climb. Now at the point where this climb levels out, there's a small gravel path that leads up to a farmhouse on the left, and this I think would be our best regroup point. So once again we're going to stand as far left out of the road to wait for everybody to catch up, but also to be safely out of the way of all the other riders and the other teams so they can pass safely. So once we're all back together, we'll then head off towards Montagu, which is a 28-kilometer stretch from that point up to Montagu. There's a few rollers along the way, but in general we'll be heading downhill at this point, and this would be another good time to do our riding in pairs with the rotations on and off. At this point, a lot of the faster teams would have already started catching up with us, and as per the Cycle Tour Trust video, it's very important that the slower teams keep left as far as possible to allow the faster teams space to pass on the right hand side. So just before we would actually get into Montagu itself, we'll take a slight detour off the R62 as we make our way towards Koopmanskloof Pass. This detour takes us through looks like a suburb of Montagu before we rejoin the R62 and head towards the tunnel. Shortly after passing through the tunnel and as we're heading now to Ashton, we'll be crossing the timing mats, and this marks the start of our 40-minute time period which we'll have for our first stop in the support zone. So from the timing mats until we actually get into the support zone, there is an average speed limit of 30 kilometers per hour as we make our way through the town. We also just need to be careful where there's an intersection between the R60 and the R62, as there will be active traffic on that road. So shortly after we've crossed over the bridge, there will be a left turn into Zandvliet Road, which is the road where all the support vehicles are standing, and we will make our way and find our support vehicle for our first stop. So after our first stop, we'll be heading along the remainder of Zandvliet Road until we rejoin the R60, and we will turn left heading towards Robertson, which is about 13 kilometers away from that point. As we approach Robertson, we'll get to a traffic circle, at which point we will turn left onto the R317 and then we'll head towards Bonnievale. After about 14 kilometers, the R317 takes a right turn, at which point there's also another water point. From this point we have about 16 km to go before we reach our second support zone at about 162 kilometers into the ride. As we approach the second support zone, we'll once again cross over timing mats, and this will mark the start of our 30-minute time period for the second stop. As we leave our second stop, there's a short climb over which that will take us down through to Bonnievale Wines. Just before then, we will cross the exit timing mats before turning right onto the R317. We will stay on this road for about 2 kilometers before turning left and making our way towards the Breërivier Crossing, which will be about 10 kilometers further on the road. This 10 kilometers does have a few sneaky rises thrown in just for good measure, and these must not be confused with the 3 dragons that will come later in the ride. We'll then cross the Breërivier Crossing, and soon afterwards there will be another water point, and after this water point there's a 6 kilometer stretch of road before we then join the R60. So as we take the right turn onto the R60, at this point we're about 183 kilometers into the race, which leaves us with about 20 kilometers to the finish, and we face the final 3 climbs. In the distance over here, you can see the first of the final 3 climbs. So these last 3 climbs, they're going to be known by different names: the 3 dragons, 3 ugly sisters, whatever you want to call them. They're going to be a test on the legs. For these final 3 climbs, I think the same process will apply, where we stop to regroup at the top of the climb before we start the descent and the climb that follows. These 3 come immediately after each other. There's no like flat section in between each, so as soon as you descended the one, you're immediately climbing into the next. So that's why I feel it's important that at the top of each one we do regroup before descending and starting on the next climb. We then have the final stretch towards the finish line, and as we turn off the R60, there's a final 1 kilometer climb up to the finish line. I hope that you found this DC route guide helpful and informative, and at the end of watching this that you have a better idea of what the day is all about.